Josh Foreman. Welcome to Breath of Life Development and a brand new tutorial series. This one is about mold making. So first of all, if you just want to see the process, if you're a just the facts ma'am kind of person, just skip to that timestamp. That'll just show the process. However, this whole video series is intended for beginners. So if you've never made a mold before, I highly recommend you stop and listen to me jabber, because I want to talk to you guys. I want you to not be afraid of mold making, because you never met a mold before are me, like about 17, 18 years ago, where I was both fascinated by the idea of making molds, but also pretty terrified because there's so much out there. So many sources of information, so many products. It's very confusing if you don't have kind of a one-stop shop of information to go to. So I'm trying to make that me right now. I'm going to give you very specific, very limited, but very specific ideas of the products to use and a process just to get started. So hopefully, seeing all these very specific things laid out in front of you, you will be less like I was back then and be not afraid. Lo, ye shall not be afraid. Nevermore. 1 Thessalonians 18:42. So, another thing. What can you do with molds? Why make molds? There are, in my mind, 3 major reasons to make molds. So, first of all, there is if you just want to make copies of your delightful sculptures, kind of like I did for these guys. You know, I'm making characters for my books, and I need them for promotional and for giveaways, and you know, maybe someday I'll be selling them and for gifts. And then another reason, which beginners often don't consider, is that you can mold parts of your sculpture and then cast duplicates of that, and that works great, especially if you're doing, you know, wings or insect legs, that sort of thing. On this Tektite here from my sculptures of Zelda figures, you can see all these legs it's the same leg, just repeated 4 times. I made a mold and cast it. Saved a lot of time. Okay, and then the other big reason is if you want to sculpt in one medium, but you want your final piece to be a different medium, such as, you know, you do it in clay, like in my Sculpey 101 series, right? And then you want to have a version that is wax for a candle, or you want it to be a clear resin, like I did for this worm that's got this glowy glob of spit. I didn't sculpt it in something transparent. I sculpted it in something, you know, some kind of clay, and then cast it and poured resin into it. I've also used this method to make a giant gummy worm, like in that one video. And you can cast your sculptures into ice or chocolate. There's just so many possibilities. It's so fun. I really want you guys to get in. So those are some examples of the kind of things you can make with your molds. Also, there are many kinds of molds. Now, I already covered the very simplest, cheapest, easiest type of mold to make in my Sculpey 101 series, episode 8. Link in the down there, look down there. And that was a push mold, where you literally just have a very flat-ish kind of sculpture. You lay it on the surface, and then you press clay or rubber or something over that. After that dries, you pop it off, and then you have your negative, and you could push or pour anything into that mold. So that is the very simplest, easiest. So for this tutorial, we're going to start out with the second easiest, cheapest type of mold making, and that is a 1-part block mold. Don't worry, there is not going to be a test. You're not going to need to remember that particular name. Now, I want to warn you that in order to keep this series as simple as possible for beginners, I'm going to be leaving out a lot of products and techniques that are out there. And I'm purposefully doing this to not overwhelm, because, like I said, when I was starting out, I was completely overwhelmed. I would have loved it if one person came to me and just said, here are a list of very specific items. So, to that end, here's a list of very specific items that I'm going to be using for this demonstration, and that you can purchase and follow along. Oh, quick note, I chose these materials specifically because they fit the criteria of being most accessible to most people and best price per quality. Now, there are some cheaper options out there. Trust me, they are not worth it. And I'm also going to have some optional options. I tried to cut these out, but I felt like it just was too constrained. So you've got an option here. All the ones that are optional, I'm noting as I go, so don't worry about that, but here's those. Okay, so now your wallet should be prepared. If you've set aside this amount of money, you know you can follow along. Oh, also, I should note, if you live in a different region, different country, whatever, and these items are not accessible to you from the links that I provided, but you do know where they are available, please leave a comment and I will grab that link and then put it in the description for people who live in other regions. That'll be really useful for them. So I appreciate that if we got a little community sharing going on here. That'd be super cool. Now, one final thing before we jump in. I talked about it in this other video where I was talking about 10 things that artists do to grow. But this idea has been so helpful to me as I've tried a million new art things throughout the years, is start small, please. Please start small. You are going to make mistakes the first couple times you do things. I still make mistakes the 100th time I do things. So you want to make sure that when those mistakes occur that you are losing the littlest amount of material, of time, sanity, money, etc., etc. You want these to be small stakes as you're starting out. And then you grow from there. It snowballs. So to that end, I chose these little busts of these characters from my book, which you all should buy. They're great books. I recommend you try something at least this simple to start out with. To prepare your sculptures before you mold them, you want to spray them with primer. Now, you can use just off-the-shelf spray paint primer you can get at the hardware store. That's fine. I prefer this. This is optional, but you can get this slightly nicer primer that's made specifically for miniatures. Well, besides being small, here are some important features of these sculptures. So, first of all, you can see they have this kind of base on the bottom of them. And one thing you need to understand is that your sculpture is going to be upside down when you pour the resin in. And this can result in air pockets if you have undercuts. Now, what do I mean by an undercut? Here's an example from Beaumark's dreadlocks here. You can see how if the air is traveling upwards, it's going to get caught in the little bubble there at the tips of his hair. Let me show you an example. Say I was going to make a mold of this whiz robe. So I pour the rubber around, then we flip the mold upside down, and as we pour the resin in, you can see these little spots of white. This is where air pockets are getting trapped. And then after the resin hardens, you pop the piece out, and what used to be air pockets have now become missing bits. In this particular instance, he's going to be missing the tips of some of his fingers and the bottom of his sleeve of wizard. Now, the other feature that these sculptures have are these pour spouts. These are very important to have because your piece is going upside down and you're going to fill it with rubber, right? Now, in theory, in a perfect world, you could pour that up and it would just be flat and level. However, this is not the perfect world we live in. Often some of your resin is going to leak out of the seams a little bit, and then it'll go down and you'll be missing a part. Or your mold's going to be slightly crooked, and then the bottom is not going to be even. So basically what these pour spouts do is they give us a little bit of wiggle room to exist in the real world. The next step is to find a container that you're going to put the sculpture in for you to pour the rubber over. Now, if you're lucky, your piece will fit into something like a plastic cup or a container of some sort, an old Tupperware, something like that, and that's great. In this particular example, you can see Beaumark fits into this cup just fine. But this can be improved. Because rubber is not cheap, you want to minimize the amount of rubber you're pouring in here. So in this case, you can see the general profile of the sculpture is it's wider at the bottom than it is at the top. But this cup tapers in the opposite direction, narrow at the bottom, wide at the top. So if I flip it over, now you can see it matches the profile of the sculpture better. That means you'll use less rubber. You can also use larger containers like this quart mixing cup that you can get at most hardware stores. If I was going to mold something like this guy, I might want to use a larger cup like this. Although even this one is not quite big enough because you always want to have at least ½ an inch of rubber around the entire sculpture. So this container is not quite large enough. And that leads me to the next thing to do. If you want to make a mold box that fits your piece the most accurately and uses the least amount of rubber, just building it yourself is often the best choice. I like to use foam core. It's cheap, readily available, easy to use. So you just use a hobby knife, cut the pieces up. Now in this case, I'm going to be molding 2 sculptures at once. So I lay them out and I do the general shape that they need to be, cut the foam core, and then hot glue the pieces in place. And as I build the box, I'm constantly checking to make sure that the pieces are going to have enough space around them for that ½ inch margin that I need for the rubber. I'm filling the seams on both sides. So I do a seam of glue to attach it, and then I do an extra bead of glue around both sides to make sure it's absolutely sealed in there. It's very easy to have your rubber leak out if you don't make sure you're double sealing everything. All right, now for bow marks. So I want to put them in this cup, which means I need a bottom for it, and then I'll hot glue the cup on. And to pour the rubber in, I'm going to need to remove the bottom of the cup, which will now be the top of the cup. Okay, here is a pro tip. Put an arrow on the bottom of your sculpture that indicates the front of the sculpture. This is going to be very important later because you're going to be cutting the rubber and you want to cut it from the back. You don't want to have a seam line that's going up the side or the front of your sculpture. And I just hot glue it in place. Now here's an optional product you can use, a mold release agent. For this kind of application, it's really not that important. The silicone that we're using is not going to stick to virtually anything, so it's not a big deal. The only exception is if you can't prime your piece. But I'm going to say you absolutely need to apply primer to your sculpture before you do this. You'll see why in a little bit. It's very important to get a nice even coat of primer on your sculpture. But I'm just going to demonstrate for the sake of it. You spray it from about 12 inches away. Doesn't need a lot. Okay, and you'll notice that I have the front of Beaumark's face closer to the edge of the cup than I have the back of his head. Again, that's because I'm going to be cutting in from the back, and I want to maximize the amount of rubber that's being pressed together at the seam. Okay, and then I do my double seal again. I glue my Scola Twins in. One thing you want to be careful about with the hot glue is it's easy to get little webs of the hot glue around, and so here's another optional thing. You can use canned air to blow stuff around. It's helpful if you get little bits of detritus in there. Okay, this Scola is just a little bit loose, so I'm going to add a little bit more hot glue. The last thing you want is for them to detach from the bottom when you pour the rubber in. And I'm just using a little bit of stick to smooth it in there. Now, I am not worried at all about how pretty this box is because it's literally going to be torn apart once I pull them out of the rubber. But I have triple and quadruple checked that all the seams are very well filled and that the sculptures are not at all loose or going to fall out. Okay, for this particular tutorial, I am recommending you use Moldstar 15 Slow. This is fairly easy to find. I've got a link in the description. If you cannot find this exact one, then you want to use one that has a long pot life. Now let me show you why I'm recommending this particular brand. Here you can see the pot life is 50 minutes. Pot life is very important for beginners. You can see here's a couple other Mold Star products, and as you can see, one is 50 minutes, one is 6 minutes, one is 45 minutes. I do not recommend the 6 minutes for beginners. Essentially what having a long pot life means is that the rubber won't get hard for longer, which means you have more time to solve problems that may pop up. And when you're a beginner, problems will pop up. I recommend using nitrile gloves rather than latex gloves because there is the possibility that the latex gloves will keep your rubber from setting properly. I also always have lots of paper towels on hand, just in a stack next to me. You're going to need them. And some stir sticks, as well as whatever containers you're going to be mixing the rubber in. Now I'm just going to estimate how much rubber I'm going to need. In this case, I know Beaumark is in a cup that is exactly the size of this cup, so I'm going to need at least that much for him, and then maybe say another cup for those guys. So I'm going to mix 2 cups, 1 cup of each part, and we'll see how far that goes. I assume it's going to be a little bit under, and that's fine. At that point, I'll mix a little bit more. There are fancy ways to figure out exactly how much rubber you need. I'll go into that in a future tutorial. Again, I'm trying not to overwhelm you with a billion things right now. Also, you're going to want to have 2 final containers, one that you pour the 2 parts into and mix, and then the final one that you pour that one in after you've mixed it to make sure it's mixed very thoroughly. Now with this particular brand, well, with all silicone rubbers, really, you're going to need to mix the parts thoroughly when you first open them. You can see there's a little bit of color mottling in there. You want to mix that up very thoroughly. Now, one of the downsides to this particular product is that part A is always lumpy. It doesn't seem to matter how fresh I get it, there's always going to be lumps in the bottom that you need to stir in as well as you can. And because this container is just, yeah, as you can see, really hard to mix in, I'm just gonna pour it into a separate container to try to mush those lumps into the mix as well as I can. Yeah, here is a booger that simply will not mix in. It's just a solidified mass. So I just get rid of that. And at this point I decided, you know what, I'm just gonna strain this. Have this extra bit of mesh laying around. You could use anything that has holes in it, really. Yeah, and there is all the gunk that you don't want mixed into your mold, including a little broken bit of stir stick. Okay, this is why I always have extra paper towels on hand. You want to wipe off the rims before you close your containers. It's just a general good practice. It'll keep things from gluing shut. And make sure you do not use the same stir stick because you do not want to mix parts A and B in the containers. That would be very bad. I'm going to use this bucket that I, mushed the part A together in. Again, you just need to get pretty close. If you're off by a percentage or 2, it's never been a problem for me. I've always been able to just eyeball it, and this rubber sets up just fine. Okay, now I'm transferring to a fresh container, because no matter how well you mix it and scrape the sides and the bottom, you will not get it perfectly. And so that always introduces more risk that it won't set up properly in every area of the mold. And use a fresh stir stick as well. Now I like to jiggle and pat it for, you know, half a minute or so just to get the biggest bubbles out. I don't think it really makes that big a difference. They're going to either rise to the surface or kind of, I don't know. Whatever the magic is with this particular rubber, it doesn't seem to stick the bubbles to the sculpture. Now when you pour, you don't want to pour directly onto your sculpture. You want to pour a little to the side. And the higher up you are, the more the little bubbles will pop because they're being forced through this very thin strand. So I just take my time with it. I usually plan to spend about 5 minutes or so just pouring the rubber carefully and slowly. It's always so satisfying to see that last little bit of island of your sculpture being subsumed. Okay, time to drown the Skulla boys here. And look at that, I ran out. Time to mix more. And it looks like probably not going to have enough. I went ahead and mixed the rest of, you know, all that I had. And I'm still seeing the tips of the ears there, so that's no bueno. We're going to have to figure out something to do about that. Now, I have maybe more than I need on the Bowmark sculpture here, so I'm going to do a little transfer. First, I'm going to get a little drop that spilled on the table or the sides there. All right, well now I feel like there's enough for the Skulla twins. But now I'm starting to see the top of Bowmark's head, so this is annoying. One option I could do, and I have done before, is I can sit here and babysit it for about half an hour to an hour and just scoop the stuff up over until it sets hard enough that it stops dripping down. But I'm going to try a different technique here. Essentially, I just need to displace enough of the rubber that's in the cup to cover up the head. So I'm using this Poxy 20. You could use any kind of hardware store self-hardening 2-part epoxy putty here. The point is that I'm pushing it into the mold and I'm keeping it against the side of the cup. And this is really important. If it falls away from the side of the cup, it could swing down and touch the sculpture. And so this is a little bit of a risky maneuver. I've done it enough where I'm confident that I can pull it off. But in general, it's best to just have enough rubber when you start. And so, yes, this is a glorious example of why it is great to have a long pot life rubber. If this was one of those 5-minute rubbers, I would be doomed. But as it is, I have plenty of time to come up with solutions to this problem. So basically, I just mix enough of this mass that it's going to displace the rubber up and over Bowmark's head, and it seems to work fine. All right, time for demolding. Woo, this is the exciting part, but also take your time. You want to do it right. First of all, I let it set overnight. Again, all rubbers say they have a certain pot life, but it's always good to overshoot it rather than undershoot it. I just make it a general rule. I always wait overnight. And I just basically destroy the mold container. Now you can see the rubber didn't quite set in between where the epoxy and the side of the cup was. But, you know, I wiped it away and it was perfectly fine. I think it was actually such a microscopically thin layer that it didn't have time to set. And because I'm a little OC, not quite OCD, but OC, I just don't like these little dangling bits. They make no difference at all, but I just like to cut them off. Okay, for removing the sculpture, always start with a fresh blade in your hobby knife, because you want to make very precise cuts. And here's where we see the arrow is paying off. We know which is the front and which is the back. And I'm going to go straight back and from the bottom to begin with. And then on this part, I'm going to cut interlocking teeth, kind of like a gear. That way, when the two parts of the rubber fit back together, I know that they're fitting together very snugly. Also, you want to overcome your temptation to really just gouge into this and pull your sculpture out. This is a very exciting time and you're going to want to just like plow through it. But I just suggest that you treat this as an art in itself. You want to slowly dig down like a paleontologist with his little brushes and mattixes and carefully approach the piece. The last thing you want to do is gouge through there or end up with funny cuts that could end up cutting a piece of rubber out. You want to make sure that your rubber there's only two parts. If there is a third part, that's going to be a piece that falls out. So you want to be careful here. It's not that it's difficult, you just want to take it slow. Now, as I'm getting closer to the actual surface of the sculpture, I'm less concerned about the interlocking teeth part of it. I'm kind of bringing that line closer to a straight line. It doesn't need to be absolutely straight, but it doesn't need to be a crazy zigzag either. Okay, and a general rule of thumb is that the easier it is to remove your sculpture, the longer your mold is going to last, but also there's a bigger chance of having more seams to cut off at the end, what we call flashing. So in this case, it was maybe a little too much resistance to pull Beaumark out there, so I'm going to cut just a little bit more at the top. You want it to have some resistance when you pull out, but not so much that you feel you're damaging the mold. Now there are two ways when you pour the resin into here that you can keep this sealed. One is to put it back in the same kind of cup that it came out of, but I've actually had more problems with leakage when I do that. The thing I recommend doing is wrapping it with rubber bands. Just try to have a nice even dispersal of the compressive forces around there. And I'm also cutting a little bit more of a funnel there so it'll be easier to pour the resin in. Okay, time to free Skolas from their cage. And again, I just don't like this ugly flashing, so I'm gonna cut it off. Now essentially I'm doing exactly what I did with Beaumark. I just cut from the back and out. I do some interlocking teeth. Now in this case, because Skola has these two big ears, I have to cut the mold in such a way that it will release. And this just comes down to whatever the shape of your sculpture is, you're gonna have to take these kind of things into account. All right, then I check the piece, and here's where I run into something that I'm actually kind of glad that I ran into it so I could demonstrate this to you. See this booger here in his eye? This is uncured rubber. And there are many things that can cause the rubber not to cure. So here's a cast that I made from the mold, and you can see this part of the eye, it's not as deep, and that's because the rubber did not set here. Why did it not set? Because I did not spray my primer thoroughly enough. These pieces were made with a 3D printer, and the resin that it comes out of inhibits the cure of this rubber. So it just needs to be primered. And so again, demanding in fact, that you spray your sculptures very well with primer. And this one turned out fine. No eye boogers. Congrats. Now this tutorial is about mold making, not casting, but it would be kind of odd to not show what you get from mold making. So here we go. This is baby powder, aka talcum powder, and it works great both as a release agent and as a way to get the resin to suck into all the little micro details. So I just kind of dump it in there, and then I pat it and shake it and rotate it to make sure that it's covered all the surfaces inside the mold. Especially in this area, because the base of these pieces have these two thin little lips that go all the way around, and I want to make sure that there is talcum powder in all of those areas. Now you can just blow this out, or you can brush it out with a fine brush like this, or you can use this other optional product, canned air. Again, works for cleaning out molds and mold boxes. It's just handy to have around the studio. I just like having canned air around. These little pointy bits on his base are going to be particularly tricky to not get bubbles trapped in, so I'm going to pay special attention to make sure that I get talcum powder in all of those little pointy bits. Now, because I want the compressive force to be 360 degrees, like coming from all directions on the cup, regular rubber bands work fine for that. But for this piece, you actually want compressive forces coming from both sides equally, not all around, not 360 degrees. So I just use this old piece of scrap wood that I have, I cut it in half, and I'm using it to sandwich the mold between. Now you don't want it too much. You want to make sure that it's snug, but not so tight that it's deforming the mold. Okay, let's talk about resins. I am recommending the Smooth Cast series here. Again, when you're buying the product, make sure that you're looking at the pot life. For a beginner, that is the most important thing you want to look for. I'm using the Smooth Cast 326, but you can see from this chart, this Smooth Cast family, here's the ones that are perfectly fine to use, and the other ones, the red X's, just avoid those. Okay, now I'm using these little mouthwash mixing cups. These particular ones have a floral pattern. I'd rather have ones that have a ruler markers on the side, but you know, this is what I could find cheap. Here's what to avoid, these animal ones. Because with these flower ones, I can always make sure I'm at the same level. I can go to the top of a particular flower petal and I know, okay, this is the same in both cups. But, you know, how do you compare a bumblebee with an alligator? You can't. So make sure if you're getting these little cups, you're getting ones with the same pattern on them. Okay, another thing you want to take very seriously is this shake well. Do that. Shake these parts, make sure they're closed very tightly. Shake them much harder than you think you will. I like to shake them and then let them sit for about half an hour to let most of the bubbles percolate out. But yeah, seriously, shake them violently. Shake them like you're Shakira on cocaine. Now this particular 326 resin is mostly transparent, so I'm going to mix in a little bit of this So Strong color tint. This stuff's kind of expensive. There are lots of ways you can color your resin, but I don't have enough experience with all the ones to be able to give you very specific direction with it. So I'm just gonna say, if you're gonna tint your resin, use this product. I know it works with it. And I'm literally just putting in 1 drop. That's plenty to be able to see the detail when you get it out of the mold. I mix it into one of the parts first, and then I mix both the parts together. Okay, and just like with the rubber, we're going to pour into a second container. The forbidden chocolate milk. But hey, there's a reason it's forbidden, kids. Do not drink this. Don't drink it. I know it's calling your name. I'm telling you. From experience, do not drink this. I'm just kidding. I don't have experience drinking it. Oh, another pro tip. Put aluminum foil down on your workspace, because just paper alone will not stop the resin from harming your beautiful countertops or tabletops. Okay, so I like to pour about half of the amount that I need, and then I'm going to slosh it around very gently and slowly and try to make sure that I'm getting it into all the little nooks and crannies. And then I go ahead and pour in the rest. And we'll set that aside for an hour or so. Now the parts where you can see there's just a thin skin around the tips of the dreadlocks, that's because the talcum powder was able to kind of keep and attract the resin there, but only in a thin skin. There's air underneath. And here you can see there's just nothing left. There's a void there, so I'll have to fill that. Now there are ways to avoid these kind of bubbles, more advanced techniques, which we'll get into in a future video. But for now I just want to show the general, if you just do it this way, this is what you're gonna get. And again, a lot of this depends on the specifics of your sculpture. If you don't have dreadlocks dangling down like this, you're not gonna have this problem. Unfortunately, I do have a problem with the chin here. So it's tilted just enough that it trapped an air bubble. And so I'm gonna have to fill that in as well. Which is not a big deal if you're just doing 1 or 2 casts of a sculpture, but if you're gonna be doing a lot of them, then this is a problem that would need to be solved in the design of the sculpture or the design of your mold. And here we see the scola. This is called flashing around the edge here, where some of the resin seeped into the seam that we cut. And here you can see the fallout of having the eye booger that where the rubber didn't quite set. And this one turned out pretty good. Gonna need to fill in the tip of the ear there, but not too bad. So there you have it. Lots of little scolas. Just what the doctor ordered. Take 2 and call me in the morning. On our next mold making class, we're going to do a bigger 2-part mold. Same sculpture, just a larger version. These were all 3D printed, in case you were wondering. And so, yeah, we'll cover how to do something this big with a 2-part mold. Little sample preview for you there. And if you like what I'm doing, I would super appreciate a like and a subscribe and a share and all that kind of good stuff. You know, if you really like what I'm doing, you could join this beautiful crew. Look at those amazing factoids that I completely made up about my $10 and up patrons. These are things that they didn't even know about themselves. As far as I know, I'm the only content creator out there that provides this service of letting you know facts about yourself that you didn't know that were made up by someone who doesn't know you. So it's pretty special, I think. Oh, also, if you are a Twitcher type do you even Twitch, bro? If you do Twitch, come check me out, Josh Foreman on Twitch. Follow, like, subscribe, and follow and share and subscribe. Also Discord. Hey, Discord me, Breath of Life Development on the Discord. Come check. Do the full of chords and disses, and sometimes there's a chord and sometimes there's Discord. And when there is Discord, I am there for you. All right. Bye, everyone.